Welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For today's episode, I interviewed Allan J. Alonzo Wind, a retired USAID Senior Foreign Service Officer and the author of Andean Adventures, which is available on Kindle Unlimited. I'm here with Allan J. Alonzo Wind, author of Andean Adventures. It's good to have you on the Heartland Author Podcast, Alonzo.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm so glad to be able to join you today.
Okay, I'll start with the first question here. In no more than several sentences, feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
I'm a retired Senior Foreign Service Officer who has worked for several decades, both with the U.S. government as well as different international and other non-governmental organizations in humanitarian assistance and international development.
Without spoiling too much of your book, tell our listeners what Andean Adventures is about.
Well, Andean Adventures is what you could call an origin story. It's basically recounting the series of experiences I had in the first few countries that I ended up serving in and living in after college. I originally had joined Peace Corps as a rural public health volunteer and served 2 years in Ecuador. And I had expected at the beginning that I would be returning to the United States after that, and that proved not to be the case.
And you've served in a number of different foreign service roles in many different countries. Is that correct?
That's correct. Over the last 3 or 4 decades, I've probably lived in and worked in over 10 countries.
That's very fascinating. Now, is your book, Andean Adventures, self-published or traditionally published?
It's self-published. A cousin, David Wind, who has been a successful writer, largely in the fiction realm, mystery and some science fiction and fantasy. He was traditionally published for many years, but he ended up going the independent publishing route and hasn't looked back. And as I looked to telling my story, which was both a memoir as well as something of what I would hope to be a parable of my experiences, it looked like the self-publishing route was the best way to go.
While your book was originally written in the English language, your book was translated into Spanish by, I apologize if I mispronounce her name here, Catherine Teseco Moya. What is it like to work with a translator on a book?
Well, this was actually the first time that Catherine had attempted to undertake a translation of something quite so large. I think she had translated papers and websites and smaller documents in the past, but I encouraged her to take it on, that it would be a collaborative process. She's Peruvian. I lived for a number of years in Peru and have deep ties to Peru, and so I thought that combining her insights and understanding and my own from my time not only in Peru but all across Latin America, we would be able to reach a happy medium.
Okay, now I will briefly mention there's a YouTube channel called Adventures of Lamari, who is, and a woman who runs that YouTube channel, who sometimes will talk about book writing related stuff, but she'll also talk about her experiences living in Germany, and she's of Peruvian ancestry.
Oh, how interesting. I don't know her. I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, it's M.L. Tishner, I believe her name is. And the YouTube channel's called Adventures of Lamari.
Well, Peru has got such a remarkably diverse experience, and one of the things I would come to actually find later on in my career was a remarkable number of Peruvians and Ecuadorians and other Latin Americans all over the world. You know, I went on to live and work for many years in Africa and Southwest Asia, and it's funny how you meet people from all different sorts of backgrounds in the most unusual places.
Now, you currently live in Virginia, is that correct?
Correct. We're back in the States, at least for now.
Now, I'm going to go into. I don't normally do this on my podcast, but because there's recent events in Virginia that are of note and are political in nature, Republican Glenn Youngkin was recently elected governor of Virginia, and during his campaign, he used what sounded like white supremacist talking points regarding public education curriculum, and he ran a paid ad during his campaign that featured a mother complaining about her son being required to read the literary fiction book beloved by Toni Morrison as part of an advanced placement class. Although the woman in the ad did not mention the book or Toni Morrison by name. As you live in Virginia, what are your thoughts about the election results in Virginia earlier this week?
Well, that's a bit of a bomb, I tell you. I was devastated. My wife and I were both devastated by what ended up happening election night, and we were so worried the same was going to happen in New Jersey as well. But, you know, I've looked at several readouts of who was voting and who wasn't voting, and there's no denying that on the one hand, Youngkin ran a brilliant campaign that was designed to appeal to a wide range of voters, not just by any means those that you might consider to be connected with the former president. I don't even want to mention his name. But
I know who you're referring to.
I mean, I sometimes call him Agent Orange, but as Spike Lee, I think, took up. But
some of the nicknames I would have for him are too profane for me to use on this podcast.
Well, I didn't want to test the language censors in terms of your podcast as well. But seriously, I mean, the reality is Youngkin ran a very smart campaign for someone who's never run for office before, and he managed to reach out and grab a hold of a key issue where McAuliffe just really flubbed it. I mean, in a debate, McAuliffe made this comment that, you know, within the context, I mean, one can understand that he was saying he didn't want to see parents going into schools and taking books off the shelves that were going to be part of the curriculum. That's understandable, but you just don't say it quite in the way that McAuliffe did. And you can look at the polls that were carried out in Virginia. He dropped something like easily 7 or 8 points. Now, he didn't run the most brilliant campaign beforehand, and I think there's an argument to be made about having a retread, having someone like McAuliffe come into the picture after having been governor before. It's amazing, as one friend of mine, who's actually a current Foreign Service officer, commented the other day, it's amazing that Youngkin didn't even try to connect McAuliffe with the Clintons or really raise that as a serious political issue, because Terry McAuliffe clearly has been very close to the Clintons for years. And the reality is there's a lot of people in Virginia, even in Northern Virginia, even State Department people, either currently serving or retired, who for different reasons were not that fond of Hillary. And it would have made it more challenging for them perhaps to vote for Terry had Youngkin really done a closer tie of McAuliffe to the Clintons, for better or worse. But, you McAuliffe just was a bit tone deaf. And when you look at the reality of who voted and who didn't vote, uh, not comparing 2020, which admittedly was an unusual year given the pandemic and the requirements for absentee and early voting, but going back to 2017, the last gubernatorial race, you see a tremendous drop off in the Democratic vote. So Youngkin not only managed to activate a lot of crazies on the right, he also activated a lot of the traditional Republicans. He activated a lot of the independents who came forward and decided to go his way, particularly after Terry McAuliffe's comment about the school boards and the book and the like. And that clearly turned off a lot of women, a lot of mothers to voting for Terry, rightly or wrongly. But Terry failed to raise up and faced a very depressed Democratic vote. And one thing that people have been very polite about, I don't want to belabor the point, but this is despite huge efforts by so-called Democratic big shots between Obama and Harris and Biden and others coming up to Virginia to campaign for Terry. Well, guess what? Somehow that was not enough to get the Democratic vote out. Had Democrats voted to the level that they did even in 2017, Youngkin would have been toast because it wasn't a blowout. I mean, in the end, Youngkin won by, 70,000 votes, 75,000 votes?
Somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 votes. I don't know if the Commonwealth of Virginia, rather, has certified the final results yet, but once they do, the final margin will probably be somewhere in that range.
And Terry
that was out of a little
lost.
over 3 million votes cast.
True, and it was a pretty good turnout, all things comparing, but there easily could have been another few 100,000 Democratic votes out there who had voted in 2017 and should have been mobilized by the Democratic Party efforts to get out the vote. And clearly the get out the vote efforts just failed, apart from Terry's own failures as a candidate.
Okay, on to my last political question. Those who hold isolationist foreign policy views tend to not believe that it's a good use of federal funds to provide humanitarian aid to foreign nations. How and why is it in the public interest of the United States to supply humanitarian aid to foreign nations?
Well, that's actually a very good question. I wouldn't consider that to be a political one. It's really one of a policy one and perhaps a development education one. There's a tremendous misunderstanding, Aaron, in the American public. When you look at the different polls, groups like Pew and others who regularly go to people and ask questions about what do you think about foreign aid, what do you think about humanitarian assistance. Over the years, including the last 10 years, you will see frequently polls that will say, oh, well, there's a fairly large plurality of voters who think that maybe we're putting too much into giving money to support programs overseas. And then you ask these people, well, what do you think would be an appropriate level of the federal government to dedicate to things like humanitarian assistance and foreign aid if you think it's too much? And they invariably come back, Aaron, with comments along the lines, when you kind of look at where most respondents answer, they say that, well, I think that 5% is probably a good amount. 10% is too much, but 5% of the federal budget is a good amount. Well, surprise, we spend less than 1% of our budget on things like humanitarian assistance, development assistance, foreign aid, all rolled up. So there's a tremendous misunderstanding in terms of how much we're actually dedicating to this, how much we're actually dedicating to the UN, how much we're dedicating to assistance overseas. There's also, Aaron, a tremendous means to give foreign aid. We do not give money to governments, generally speaking. I mean, if you take out the so-called military and security support, which also tends to involve not so much giving cash in terms of actually giving essentially credit cards for governments to go and buy weapons. If you're looking at humanitarian assistance and economic aid and similar type of assistance, the vast bulk of it, with certain exceptions, involves actually support to non-governmental organizations, civil society, other kind of multinational supported programs within countries that are in many ways insulated from what you would consider to be the traditional risks of corruption. The whole idea of putting money down a rat hole, of making money available to leaders who are going to steal it. We don't do that. I don't say that that didn't happen in the past, but that hasn't been a reality of things for decades.
Now I'm going to go back into writing-related questions, as I have a few more of those. When you attended Stuyvesant High School in New York City, I apologize if I mispronounced the name of that a little bit.
Stuyvesant. It's named after Peter Stuyvesant from the original Dutch colony in New York.
Okay, when you attended Stuyvesant High School in New York City, you studied creative writing under the legendary Frank McCourt, who is an Irish-American writer. How did studying creative writing help you develop your writing skills?
Well, I think I have joked about that a little bit in the sense of writing science fiction was a good preparation for government work. But more seriously, taking creative writing with Frank as well as other teachers that I've had at that time in high school and later on in college helped me, I think, with composition and with expression and frankly with one of the most important things, which I think is persistence. It's consistency. It's when you have to actually write something, sitting down and avoiding the kind of self-editing and self-correcting and modifications that frequently happen with a writer at first, sitting down and just dedicating a chunk of time, being an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, to just writing straight through, not allowing any kind of self-criticism or self-editing, and then later on going back and doing what editing may be required, more easily understandable, to make sure it's in the right voice, to make sure it's actually expressing the ideas that you want to do. At least I have found that to be a very useful approach to my creative writing.
What is your typical writing routine if you have one?
Well, I have learned something called the Pomodoro method through some mentors of mine that I have had over the last couple of years, particularly in terms of this exercise of getting published my first book. And the Pomodoro method involves sitting down early in the morning for 25 minutes straight and just writing, and then getting up for 5 minutes to walk around and kind of clear the head, and then returning for another 25-minute session. And doing that for as many times as I'm able to over the course of the morning. Let's say 3 or 4 times in the morning. And then going back later on to look at what I've written. That's after, of course, I've managed to outline out my ideas, what I want to try and get across. I've been able to perhaps take the bones of the outline and fill it in a little bit with some key words that will remind me of stories that I want to tell, anecdotes that I want to tell within the structure of the outline of what I'm working on. And I'm trying to apply that now in the context of the second book that follows Andean Adventures, because Andean Adventures is basically a recounting of my first 12, 13 years overseas in Ecuador, Bolivia, and Peru, and how, in fact, I took the experience of Peace Corps and built on that and ended up developing a vocation in terms of international development. I'm now working on what might be the subsequent chapters of that to talk about my experiences elsewhere in Latin America and Africa and Southwest Asia.
I do have one last question, but before I do that, I want to mention that your book, the ebook version of Andean Adventures, is available on Kindle Unlimited, and I will be reading that after I finish this interview.
Great.
Okay, and now to my final question. Judging by your biography, you seem to be a big fan of science fiction books. What are some of your favorite science fiction books to read?
Well, that's a tough question. In years past, I used to really enjoy reading from authors like Greg Bear and Larry Niven. I was always a big fan of what you would call hard science fiction that was grounded in some sort of scientific reality. I never was a huge fantasy type of fan. I've been reminded of my past enjoyment, of course, of Frank Herbert and all of his Dune books and some of the books that his son followed after Frank Herbert's death, of course, because of the release of the new Dune movie. And I've been reminded of Foundation, not just the original Foundation trilogy, but some of the subsequent books on Foundation that were done by Isaac Asimov, as a result of the new Apple TV Plus show that I've been watching, Foundation, which is the first time it's been brought to the screen. And I mean, I've had tremendous enjoyment from both. And I actually met Isaac Asimov as a boy, as I was growing up in New York and going to different science fiction conventions and Star Trek conventions and the like. And I remember going up to Isaac Asimov and asking him advice as a writer.
Wow, so you've met Isaac Asimov in person.
I have. He was such a character. I remember he had two lovely young women on his arms when I interrupted him, coming away from phone booths. And he made some sort of shtick about that, some sort of joking around about the women and all that. I was a very impressionable young teenager at that point. I think I was 14 or 15 years old. But I asked him, excuse me, Dr. Asimov, but please tell me how it is that you do what you do. And he leaned back and laughed and he said, "Boy, do you know how much money I made in my first 11 years as a writer? I made $7,000 in my first 11 years as a writer. You're not going to make any money being a writer. But if you're really serious about it, well, you have to do what I do. I sit down before my typewriter and start hacking away, typing away, clickety-clack for 3 hours and do that every single day." It left me very impressed. And, Isaac Asimov was not just an incredibly prolific science fiction writer, but it seems like he wrote about everything, almost every nonfiction topic you can imagine. I think he published something like 200 books.
That is a remarkable encounter you had with Isaac Asimov. That will conclude this interview. Thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author Podcast, Alonzo.
Thanks very much, and I hope you have a great day and weekend.
All right. I look forward to reading Andean Adventures, and I enjoyed interviewing Alonzo for this podcast. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at authoraac.wordpress.com. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter at authoraac. You can also watch videos on the Heartland Author channel on YouTube. Copyright 2021, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of its audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.